planting soybeans is not very profitable right now. Hi everyone, Matthew Kruse at CommStock Investments. I want to focus on the growth that we're seeing in Brazil's soybean acres. I'm going to be sharing a lot of information on that. Of course, the hot topic button here in the last week has been the China trade deal, and I know that you're probably tired of maybe seeing a lot of the estimates, but I wanted to chime in, give my 2 cents here, and we're seeing a pullback in the markets today. We saw an impressive rally here based off of a lot of the euphoria from that trade deal agreement. But just to kind of put things into perspective a little bit, that a 10-year historical average of purchasing pattern from China, they've bought a little over a billion bushels. And so you've probably seen this already, but even in the larger projected years for 26 and 27, that 25 million metric tons that China has supposedly agreed to purchase from us comes a little bit below that. So not that they couldn't buy more than that, but based on what the minimum amount that they're willing to buy, it still comes in below what their historical average purchase has been. Any trade deal, as some would argue, is probably better than no trade deal. But this is, I think, in part why you're seeing the reaction in the markets that you are today, because, it still is an unbinding trade agreement, meaning there's really no consequences if they don't follow through on this. And ultimately, it still comes down to where does China get the best deal? And if we want to encourage more buying from China, what's happening right now isn't going to help things, where we're seeing a big rally here in the U.S. market and vice versa, that basis levels have been collapsing in Brazil. And so basically our beans are getting more expensive while Brazil beans are getting more cheaper. And so they aren't going just to buy our beans just to, meet the conditions of this deal. Ultimately, they're going to buy where it makes the most sense. And right now, that's still Brazil, where it is cheaper. And if we have $12 beans and Brazil has $10 beans, they aren't going to buy our beans. They're going to go back to Brazil, which is, I think, what's happening right now. And that's why you're seeing the reaction of the market the way you are, as there have been reports this morning that China has gone back to buying a lot more Brazilian soybeans. And I think all things considered equal, that's going to be the case for a while. Now that can change. I think that it's not to say that they couldn't come back and, next year and end up buying a lot more than this. But just to put things into perspective, I think that the market's reaction was kind of becoming a little bit more speculative and a little irrational at this point. But switching back to what's going on in Brazil, Brazil planting paces begin to slow a little bit, but it's still right on target with where they have been historically. They're over 50% planted now in the country. And I think they're on the home stretch in states like Paraná and Mato Grosso. And they're just kind of getting started in a lot of northeastern states in Brazil right now. This is the weather pattern looking out here through mid-November. You can kind of see for the most part, most areas, regions are going to see pretty good weather, pretty good heavy rainfall that I think is more or less conducive to the development of the crop. There's maybe some drier spots in the northern Amazon region and northwest Mato Grosso, but there aren't as much soybeans up in those areas as well. And so most of the major production areas, it looks like, are going to get pretty good rainfall. There's parts maybe in western part of Mato Grosso that might not get near as much as what they want or as they need. There have been reports of some replanting in those areas of Sapazal in the western portion of Mato Grosso. There have been reports of some hail damage in the south in the state of Paraná as well, and a lot of replanting that's going to take place there. And so we'll have to see. They can replant the soybeans, and it probably won't affect the soybean yield that much. What it would affect is the second crop corn, which follows it. And so we'll have to see. Some of them might just decide to give up on the beans and go right to corn and maybe give their corn a better shot at full productivity. But I think still, for the most part, kind of isolated incidences. Now we see here through mid-November pretty good rainfall in Rio Grande do Sul here in the south. Now we get out into the kind of mid-December, and that shifts, where we're starting to see the effects of La Niña, which typically is described as kind of a drying trend in the south and also into neighboring Argentina. And so we are seeing that. It does show solid rainfall to the north. And so the majority of Brazil, looking out into December, it looks pretty good, but we do see some drying shift here into the southern part of the country. Now, we've talked about in the past, we are seeing La Niña, shift to La Niña weather pattern in Brazil. And this is more or less what you tend to look for, common impacts of those La Niña trends, that you do see some drought risks in the southern part of Brazil that does extend over into parts of Argentina. You do see pretty good rains for the most part in the north, and maybe they start a little bit late in kind of the center west region, but they tend to pick up over time. But most of roughly 70% of Brazil's soybean production comes to the north. But it's not to say that depending on how excessive the drought is, it might have an impact on the market. But if it's limited to just Rio Grande do Sul, it might not have that big of an impact. But this is really what I want to focus on here is, what are the land acreage trends that a lot of analysts like myself are kind of looking to estimate what that is going to be going forward into next season. Now, if you take over the last 20-year period and you add up all this and divide by 20-year period or 25 years, what this is, it basically comes out to just over 5%. That's what Brazil's average land expansion growth rate is on the soybean area year after year is 5% growth. You can look back into the early 2000s where they were almost 17%. Had 3 years in a row, it was double digits. And then that kind of pulled back, especially in that 06, 07 year where they were down 9%. But ever since then, they never looked back. That was the last year, almost 20 years ago, when they actually reduced their soybean acres, where they probably overexpanded in those years in the early 2000s. You think about that, I mean, some of the basically farmers that are under 40 years old in Brazil have never experienced a year where they didn't have land expansion. And that's something that I hear a lot from them about when I talk to them, especially the younger farmers. They say, oh, we always grow. We always grow. There's never a year where we don't have land expansion. Now, that might be put to the test here recently as margins have compressed. And I think soybean profitability remains somewhat elusive in Brazil right now. And you are kind of seeing that in the good years in the 2021, 2022, where expansion did pick up, reaching 6.4%. 5%, followed by another 6.5% growth. And now as we enter this year where soybean prices have begun to drop, you see that acreage expansion kind of pull back a little bit. But there's still something. And the point now that they've gotten so large that even a 1% increase or 2% increase is still 1, 2, 3 million acres. It's still a lot of land just because of they've accumulated so much mass now. And so looking into next year, myself, this 3.6% is coming from CONAB in Brazil, and that's what they're looking for. I personally would be surprised if it is that much. I think it's a little bit overstated just because of the lack of profitability right now, but that is the number that CONAB has. We've seen some private estimates lower, closer to 2%. I wouldn't be surprised if it was closer to 1% myself. That's kind of what I'm looking for. But based off of that, this is where, if it was that 3.6%, it would take us to this 121.3 million acres for this 25-26 season that's being planted there right now. So a pretty big jump from last season. I mean, that's adding 4.3 million acres, and it's adding 4.3 million acres at a time when planting soybeans is not very profitable right now, anywhere in the world for that matter. And so that's what's kind of concerning, is, at least to me, and it should be to maybe U.S. growers, is that historically speaking, when soybean prices were good, you saw expansion increase. When soybean prices were poor, you saw expansion slow or even come to a halt. And if this 3.6% is true, what that basically tells me is there's enough new money coming in from outside sources that the land expansion is no longer as highly correlated to what the soybean prices are and what the level of profitability is. And so time will tell. Those numbers, have plenty of time to be adjusted, and most likely will. But that's kind of what CONAB, I guess, for the time being, is seeking out. There was a study recently done by Banco Itaú, which is one of the largest banks in Brazil, kind of analyzing how much acreage is available for expansion in Brazil. And that's the big question a lot of growers have here, is how much more land can they convert? Now, they have as much as 400 million acres of pasture in Brazil that could, and that's where a lot of the growth is coming from. It isn't necessarily coming from the Amazon, and I'm not saying there isn't a single acre being transferred from the Amazon rainforest to row crop production, but predominantly it's pasture land that's being converted to row crop production, and there's 400 million acres of that. Now, not all 400 million acres of that is good quality, but they kind of target about 70 million acres of that 400 million they felt was high quality land that could be eventually converted to row crop production. And, if their current rate of growth at 70 million acres, at roughly 5% growth year over year, they could, in theory, do that in a 10-year time frame, add an additional 70 million acres on top of the projected 121 million. The point is, there's a lot of growth potential yet to come. Now, I think it'll take a little bit longer than that, just as commodity prices have their ups and downs in different cycles. But even if, let's assume they did add that whole 70 million acres in, that would add another 105 million metric tons to the 175 million metric tons that more or less that's projected right now. So you're talking a soybean production overall in Brazil that in the next 10 years, 15 years could reach 275 million metric tons. So there's a tremendous amount of potential there. And similarly on the corn acres are going to expand, maybe not quite as fast, but they will expand more or less conjointly with those soybean acres. And so they could add another 52 million metric tons of corn production on top of the 131 million metric tons, which I think is what the USDA has projected. I think it might end up being a little bit higher than that this year, but that's working with what the USDA number has. And so that means you can basically get to 183 million metric ton production in corn in Brazil in the next 10 years, 15 years, more or less, something like that. So that's kind of what we're seeing there for expansion there. People always ask, well, where's that land coming from? And this is the annual deforestation rate. And this is kind of a timely topic because the United Nations is hosting their annual climate conference in Brazil, in northern Brazil here next week, actually. And so this is what the deforestation rate has done. And Brazil's made a commitment to have zero deforestation by the year 2030, which isn't that far away, depending on what period of time you look at. You go back to 2004, well, they've made a lot of progress, right? Where they had 27.8 thousand square kilometers that were cleared in the Amazon rainforest in that year, where now more recently they're estimating 5,800 square kilometers in Brazil. And so there is a difference also, it would appear, between who is president of Brazil. While Lula maybe in his own country is not that popular, he should probably be more popular with environmentalists, as he has a pretty good track record of reducing deforestation in Brazil. And Bolsonaro publicly was much more open about wanting to develop the rainforest, and so subsequently saw an uptick in deforestation in Brazil going on there. But they still have a ways to go if their goal is in the next 5 years to basically get it down to zero. But they are making progress there. I didn't overlay those two graphs, but if you saw how the soybean acres were increasing year over year, 5% year over year, but yet here you have a pretty big decrease here from 2004 to 2012. And then now you're seeing another decrease again from 2021 to 2025. And so this basically refutes the idea that, all this land expansion is coming from the Amazon rainforest. And so it's just not true. I'm not saying there isn't a single acre someplace that's happening. It probably is. But by and all, you are seeing a slow and steady rate of deforestation in the Amazon. It's probably not as quick and fast as what a lot of people would like, but it is kind of happening. It is slowing. But that 5,800 square kilometers, it's still, a reasonably large size. I think that's about the size of the state of Delaware in 1 year in that 5,800. But they are making progress there, and I think they'll continue to make more progress. But the point is, you're seeing deforestation rate fall in conjunction with an increase in soybean acres, because, as I stated, a lot of those acres are coming from pasture. And so hopefully that puts things into a little bit perspective for you and kind of what a lot of the potential growth in Brazil has for the future. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in and like our YouTube page. Thank you and have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.